all, everything is
right. That's why you already got it.
A lot of people do.
I hate that. I think like people that do that are like serial killers.
What?
Yeah.
I don't understand.
Like you're really a psycho if you do that.
Good evening. We are back with Pain Reality. And today's episode is not my episode. Julius Payne decided he wanted to.
So it is your episode.
Well, but it ain't my episode where I'm doing all the talking, like trying to pull questions out of you.
You never do all the talking.
For the most part, I do.
But I digress.
Because you, right. So, anyways, I'm going to let him introduce.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So welcome.
Welcome.
We're going to talk to Tia Payne tonight. And I am going to have the pleasure of doing the interview, so to speak. So I'm gonna be asking the questions. Tia gonna be doing 99.999% of the talking. And we're basically tonight, we're going to talk about her finding the purpose in her pain. Shout out Pastor Ray now for your book. But yeah, because like I forget who we were talking to or what we were talking about, but the topic just popped in my head, and then I was thinking like, be a good question to ask Tia Payne.
Good question to ask Tia Payne.
Good evening. Who was that? Kayla K. Sparks. All right, so without further ado, so real quick background, Tia, would you just and you don't have to go into because like I mean I don't know if most people know, but you know like you told your story before, you tell testimonials and stuff like that, and you like share things with people. But can you just real quick, because I'm kind of like focused on like two specific situations. Like I know what I mean, like we all have a bunch of pain in life, but like the two that you share, like but the growing up, right, how you grew up, and then your first marriage. So like those were the two kind of situations that I had in mind when I thought of this topic for us to discuss. So just real quick, can you give us a quick background blurb of those situations and why this would be a situation of talking about your pain from those situations?
Mm-hmm. So everybody know at this point I do a lot of talking surrounding domestic violence and sexual assault and all those topics. So my dad, like we grew up as the preacher's kids in our family, and so my parents actually separated due to domestic violence. So I actually didn't even know my dad until I was 9, I think. Because my parents separated when I was 2. And so I didn't really have any memory of my dad until probably I was, I don't know, probably 8 or something like that. And then soon after that, like I was 9. And then I remember my mom coming to me and telling me that my dad was going to be coming home. So of course I'm like excited. Like I prayed for this. Like that's a whole nother story. But I prayed for my dad to come home. I was so excited. And I would say probably within that first few months of my dad coming home, things just went horribly, horribly wrong. So it was 7 kids in our family, and we literally always had the house where everybody came over our house like to play because it was so many kids and we was all different ages. So we had so many friends, so many people would come over our house. We planned, and we always had a big house with a big basement and a big backyard. And so all I remember is when my dad came home, like that all changed. Like we couldn't laugh. Like I like to laugh. Like who did I marry, first of all? But I enjoy laughter. And I just remember we were never allowed to laugh after that. Like I know people always say the description of walking on eggshells. Like that's how it literally felt. Is like you were walking on eggshells in our house. Like you couldn't laugh, you couldn't speak real loud. Like, and that was in the first 3 months of my dad coming home. It was like this dark cloud was like over our house. Um, and so soon after that, like everything changed. Like you had to, like my mom would literally tiptoe up to us and tell us to be quiet if my dad is upset about this, that, or whatever. And so one of the first incidents I remember with my dad is so we was fighting kids growing up. Somebody always was trying to fight us growing up. I don't know why, but people was always trying to fight us. And so my older brothers in particular, they was the fighters. And so this one particular day, like this is the first time, like even though you felt the atmosphere in our house switch around, like my dad never like put his hands on us in well, I mean 3 months. I mean, but you know what I mean. So after that first 3 months, that was the first big incident where I remember, like you could hear stuff at nighttime, like with my mom and dad, like arguing and stuff like that. But he never put his hands on us until this one particular day that we were fighting at school, or actually my brothers were fighting at school. And I've always been for lack of a better word, I was like a deviant kid. So I did my own thing for the majority of the time. And so I walked home by myself this particular day, but we were already late. So that was the other thing that changed. Like if school got out back then, I want to say like 3:15 or 3:10 or something like that. We literally had like maybe 10 or 15 minutes that we literally had to get home in the house, or my dad, like it was bad. And so this day, well, did none of us get home till like probably close to like 4 o'clock. And I remember I walked in the house and my dad started screaming and yelling, like wondering where we were at, because we were all scattered. And we had this rule, like we left the house together, we all had to come back home together. And that didn't happen this day. So I remember he yelled at me and made me go upstairs. And so, I just walked upstairs. And then probably 10 minutes later or so, I just hear all this screaming and yelling. And if you're not in the presence, but you hear fighting sounds, you know what fighting sounds like. It was bumping and grunting and just all of this type of stuff, and kids crying and my mom crying. And so I actually ran downstairs. And by the time I got downstairs, I see my cousin literally fly across the room, and she hit the wall. And so she slides down the wall. And so I'm like, at this point, I'm stunned. So I run across there to try to figure out what's going on with my cousin, because she wasn't moving at this point. And I wanted to try to figure out like what happened. And so I ran over there, and I remember like cradling my cousin, like trying to get her to wake up at this point. And then my dad just at that point, like he lost it. Like my dad was very, very narcissistic too. And so he like literally lost it. And all I remember is this strange sound, and then just all this pain, to where like my dad literally broke my nose because he was so mad that I had tried to help my cousin. Like I thought she was like dead. I was 9. So I thought she was like dead or something like that. So I was trying to help my cousin. And I remember he hit me so hard, like I kind of flew back to the wall. But as I flew back to the wall, I was still like cradling my cousin, like cradling her, like still trying to protect her, even though like my dad, like yelling and calling me all kind of names. And since he was just mad because he felt like I was trying to save somebody that he was taking all his anger and rage out on at that particular moment in time. And so that was the first moment I felt like my voice had, like I lost my voice. Like I literally went silent. So if that was in, like my dad came home in the springtime. And so this was like late spring, I think maybe, I don't know, it wasn't fall because my birthday was in October. But I remember from the moment he hit me in my face like that, like I stopped speaking. So I didn't speak for months. Like it's specifically to my dad, but I was like real quiet. I remember I had to stay home from school till my nose healed. And when I went back, I remember I told, and I don't know if they just didn't believe me, or back then it was taboo to talk about, because, I'm telling, and, it was like nothing that was done. Um, And so I remember finally my teacher. I had this teacher who I love this teacher, and I finally remember her finally just having that conversation with me. And so eventually she ends up calling children's services. Children's services comes to our house, and I, again, as a deviant kid, I was made out to be a liar. All my brothers and sisters was like, that didn't happen. You know, that's not true. And then they left, and I got in trouble. And so again, here I am silent. So I actually didn't really start speaking to my dad again until months later on my actually on my birthday, because to make up for what he did, he threw me a birthday party. And so it was almost like I was forced to speak to him because it was all these people at our house and I still didn't speak to him. And I remember him making this comment like, oh, she's mad at me, so she feels like she doesn't have to speak. And then I got this look from my mom, which is one of those, you need to do something different. So but that was like the most, that was the one incident that I'll always remember, because that was the very first time my dad ever put his hands on me for something, for me trying to be who I'm naturally. I'm naturally a protector. Like my career involves helping people. And so me trying to help somebody is the one time I was hurt by somebody that I felt like should have loved me the most. Like, you're my dad. You should love me the most beyond anything as your daughter. And so to experience that type of pain, from my dad, who I prayed for him to come home, like really, that was like a big difference. Like that kind of changed something. So then that became our normal. Um, Although it was like this wasn't normal, after you keep experiencing it for so long, every single day there's an incident, or like we used to term the change in our house, we used to term it like his black moods. Like you would go maybe a few weeks, maybe a month, and then the atmosphere would change again. Like then you would feel like that, oh my God, hush, don't talk, don't creak on the steps, don't do no extra sounds, or you're going to get in trouble. And so that was just this thing that kept happening over and over and over and over and over. Or waking up in the middle of the night to my mom crying, or screaming, or whatever the case may be. Like that literally became like the normal part of our house. So we grew up not knowing that it should have been different, because by the time my dad came back home, that's what we experienced. Like that became the normal of what we experienced. So, and it never changed. Like my dad stayed the same, and from him coming home to me at 9 to when I left at 18 going to the military. Like it never ever changed. My dad always stayed the same. He was always abusive. There was always an issue in our home. And then I'll say again, I was a deviant kid, so I was always kicked out. I was always called bees by my pastor father. Like that was the other part of it. Like we was the preacher kids. Like he was the pastor of our church. But at home he was like this other guy. He wasn't the preacher that you seen, at church. And so until I left our home to go to the military just to get away, that was what we experienced. So, my I don't know, like the last 2 years of me even being at home, I was kicked out so many times I barely stayed at home. Like I always floated like pretty much to my uncle's house. Like my uncle and my aunt took me in for the most part, because my dad, there was always an issue. Um, there's this thing people always talk about, how when you're dealing with somebody who's narcissistic, you never let them see them affecting you. Like you try to be as blank as possible for the most part. And my dad hated that about me. So I love to read. I'm on punishment. My punishment is not, I got to be in my room. My punishment is I can't do the things that I enjoy. So I didn't want to be around my family because it was so horrible being around family. So I wanted to be in my room. My punishment was I had to be around family. Like, no, you're going to sit down here, right? And I had to sit right next to my dad on the couch, and I couldn't move. That was my punishment for like months. Or, oh, you like to go to the library and you like to read, so your punishment is you can't do that. And it wasn't because I actually did anything. It would literally be because I didn't cry, or I didn't show fear, or I didn't do all of the normal things that you would think in an abusive household somebody would do. I didn't do those things because I it bothered him. So I figured like, well, it bothers you that I'm not crying right now, so I'm just not going to cry anytime you do something to me. I'm not going to show you any type of emotion that became the thing that saved me, is not showing my dad emotion. Like my face would be blank, even as I'm sitting here on punishment next to him on the couch. Like you can feel a wall, because in my world you're no longer there, because this is how you're treating me. So I don't accept you in my world at this point. And it gave me satisfaction because he knew I was doing that, and it affected him more than it did me. And it wasn't like I wasn't scared, but it's like, if the only thing I have to survive is to not show you fear, then that's exactly what I'm gonna do. So you be mad, and I'm gonna just sit over here stone faced like you don't exist. And so then introduce the pastor of the church who take members into our home when something happens to their home. And that was how I met my ex-husband. He lived with us for like probably 2 years. So he's seen everything that my dad did. Like my dad calling me names, my dad uh, kicking me out, throwing stuff at me, abusing my mom, my siblings. He's seen all of those things for that time period. So at 14, 15, I'm starting at that point to repeat the cycle that I didn't even know I was repeating. Him showing up, you just don't never go to your school, because now you go to my school and you're in my classes, and you're making sure that I'm not talking to guys, or a guy is not walking me home and doing. And if he seen me talk to somebody, that was like this thing I had to explain. And for lack of a better word, it's all toxic is already normal to me. Even though it's like I know like it's not normal, it's already normal. So I'm explaining, but at the same time, I get this giddy feeling like, oh, he really cares about me, because other than that, he wouldn't care if I talked to somebody. He cares because he's making me not talk to other people. And so that cycle repeated. And although we went our separate ways when I went to the military and stuff like that, by the time it came back around, this was in the midst of me and Jew had went our separate ways. I ended up hooking back up with him, and eventually ended up like marrying him. And we were married for 5 years, to where that cycle of violence started back over, pretty much from the point of me finding out I was pregnant up until I ran to California to get away from him when he pulled a gun on me and Jalen and Janai. That cycle continued again, to where it became the normal to live in such a toxic environment where you walk on eggshells and you literally try to stay out somebody's way just to survive. That I'm gonna pick with you, and I'm gonna say this to you, or I'm gonna spit on you, or I'm gonna try to hit you, or I'm gonna do all of these things to you so I can get a reaction out of you. So I literally relived how I lived with my dad growing up, trying to just be dead all the time. I literally relived that with my ex-husband, because he literally was just like my dad. Like it was so crazy, because he was literally just like my dad. So all the practices I put in place to try my hardest to stay under the radar of my dad, I had to do that in my first marriage until I was able to get away from him. Because don't show a reaction, don't show that you hurt, don't show that you're scared or you feel some type of way, because then that feeds whatever they got going on or whatever, and so they try to attack it even more. So I literally had to become this silent, like dead person, just to be able to survive. And that was the only thing I knew. I'm raised in a household where they don't advocate for divorce. They advocate you once married, always married. You ain't getting a divorce, you stay there. God ain't pleased with you if you decide you want a divorce and you actively get a divorce. Then you just got a whole D on your chest at this point, like, oh, the scarlet letter, because you got a divorce. So don't nobody want you around. So divorce wasn't an option. When I talked divorce, I was told I couldn't have a divorce. So it wasn't as if I wanted to stay there, but because my faith and my relationship with God became a really big part of me getting through that marriage. And it was how I was raised. Like for years growing up in church, this is what you are taught to do. You stay in your marriage, you don't leave. So although it's abusive and it was crazy and it was sexually degrading and all of these horrible things happened to me in this marriage, there was no out for me that didn't lead to me going straight to hell. And I didn't want to go to hell. So I stayed. I stayed in that marriage until, I was able to get to a good church that taught against that. And then that was how I was able to finally disengage from that marriage and feel okay spiritually to be like, oh yeah, I gotta leave. I gotta get it. Even though I had left him, we were separated heck, we lived in separate households. Like I was in California for a good part, but we lived separated for, let's see, 3 years before our divorce was finally final. We managed to stay married for 5 years, but I want to say three and a half of those years we lived separated because I couldn't take all the stuff that was going on. Like I was drinking, I was doing all kind of like stuff just to be able to survive. And so once he pulled the gun on me and I left, it wasn't like I was raring to go back, even though I stayed married to him another 3 years before I could get a divorce.
All right, so uh,
You
um
got questions?
yeah. So my first question is, I mean, obviously I don't know if any 9-year-old is going to understand purpose, so to speak, in those situations. But as you got older, um, and the situation with your dad continued, and then you got older and you were dating Tupac, I mean your ex,
He
and
was crazy.
and then went on to marry him. At any time, like, did you understand purpose, like that there may be a purpose in what you were going through?
So when I first got out the military, all I knew was I wanted to help kids. Like I just felt like there had to be a way for kids to be able to talk about some of the trauma that they, and I didn't even understand the word trauma at that
Mm-hmm.
point. I just knew there should be some way that there could never be another kid like Tia
Mm-hmm.
who felt like I couldn't talk when something bad happened to me. So I ended up going into child development. That's what my degree is, child development. That's what
So,
I pursued.
but that's what I mean. So you began to realize that or think about that when you went to school, or like how
When I went to the military.
when you went to the military.
Mhm.
Okay, all right. And you said child what?
Child development.
Child development.
Well, I mean, my mom had, when we was growing up, my mom had a home daycare,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's what she did. And so, well, I guess that's where the spark came from. Is because I felt like, oh, well, I'm gonna just follow in my mom's
Mm-hmm.
footsteps, and I'm gonna have a home daycare, which I actually did have a home daycare before, but I was gonna follow in my mom's footsteps and have a home daycare because I wanted to get kids when they was little.
Right, right.
Like I felt like if I can get them when they was little and instill in them that they don't have to accept.
So when did you start to feel like that, like that other part where it's like they don't have to accept the toxic behavior, they don't have to accept abuse, they don't have to accept the different stuff that you dealt with? Because I mean, saying I wanted to go do what my mom did is a natural thing for a kid.
Right.
Like adding the other parts to it, when did that come about?
After I got out the military.
After you got out of the military.
Yeah.
So that up to that point, you were like, I'm gonna do what my mom did, but and not, please don't take this the wrong way, but not with purpose.
Right.
It was just that's what my mom did.
Yep. So she made good money.
Yeah. So that's what I'm gonna do.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you go through all this. You go to the military. You come back, and then that sparks a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
I won't even say your purpose necessarily, like a purpose. Because do you feel like beyond that, do you feel like you've had multiple reasons and purposes birthed out of all the stuff that you've been through?
Mm-hmm.
So talk about that a little bit.
So when I came back from the military,
no, wait a minute. I'm sorry. Don't talk about that yet. Got one more question.
Okay.
How hard was it to come to that realization that at the moment was your purpose, or was going to be your purpose?
So the crazy part is, although I felt like once I decided, after I got out the military and I decided where I was going.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you got out the military, you and him were not married.
No.
Okay.
I met you. Well, I met you before I went to the military.
Yeah, you did. But whooped in spades. But I digress. Continue. Shirley Miller, remember?
Anyways, so
Sorry,
once I got out of the military, and really the only reason I naturally start pursuing child development is because school was paid for.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, well, if I'm gonna do something, then I might as well, get a degree in child development because that's what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started school, like one of the courses that we had to take, we had to do like these case studies,
Mm-hmm.
and part of the case studies it was, and I was working in a daycare at the time, but it was like one of the case studies. It was a kid that had been traumatized.
Mm-hmm.
And based off of that case study, that's when I started formulating the idea of, oh, I can catch them when they're young, and that way they don't turn out like I turned out.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when even though I still pursued child development, my focus shifted, so to speak. And so then I started looking for like specialized like courses or
Mm-hmm.
like certification classes that I could take, really streamlining working with like kids who had like special needs and different stuff like that. So yeah.
All right. So a case study
Mhm.
kind of nudged you that way
Yeah.
to say, I want to make sure that this doesn't happen to other kids.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So so you that becomes your purpose in that season, in that time. So how did that grow and evolve?
So I was a assistant director at this daycare,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the classes that we had was kind of geared towards kids with special needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had this sibling set that had been adopted, but they came from trauma, like a whole bunch of stuff that happened to them. And so I ended up becoming friends with the lady who adopted them, and she actually began to tell me about this job that she worked as a youth advocate.
Mm-hmm.
But they specialize in kids who witness violence, like violence in the home. It could be violence in the schools, in the
Mm-hmm.
streets, anything that involved a kid witnessing some type of violent act. They were the team of people that was called to the
Right.
scene, like a mini, crisis intervention for adults, but for kids. And so she began to tell me about this job, and then of course I'm like, oh, that sounds like even more where I want to be at, because
Mm-hmm.
I know those type of things.
Right.
But she ended up telling me like, oh, people love our job. So since the program has started, no one has ever left. And the program had been around, I think by that point, it's like 4 years or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody ever left. And so, we continued to talk. And then I remember maybe a couple weeks after she told me that, she came back. She was picking her kids up from the daycare this one day. And she looked at me and she said, you'll never believe what happened. Like somebody turned in their notice today because they're getting married and moving out of state or something like that. And I was like, "Ooh, I'm interested." She said, "No worries." She said, "I actually already turned in your name. So you should actually expect a call," which I'm like, okay, they calling me. That's weird. And so they actually did. Her boss ended up calling me probably in the next couple days or something like that. She ended up calling me to find out if I was actually interested in interviewing for a job, which I was. And so I ended up interviewing for the job, which happened to be the position I was going to take, because it was like a collaborative program. My position actually ended up being with Victim Assistance Program. And so through me being hired at that point, let me backtrack. So I set up the interview, and the day before my interview, I got the call that my dad died. My brother actually ended up calling me because they were still in California, and so my brother ended up calling me. Well, he had called me earlier that day and told me that my dad had a heart attack, but he was like real calm about it, so there was no worry that maybe my dad was gonna die or nothing like that. And so I remember I stayed up. I had some friends over to the house, and we all actually stayed up, like was trying to wait to get the call from my brother that the surgery he unexpectedly had to have was good. And so I remember at probably 1 o'clock our time, he ended up calling me, and all he said was like, "Dad is gone." And then he hung up. Like there was no other conversation, like no nothing. It was just like, boom, he did. Now let's hang up. And so I just kind of sat there stunned, like, is he really? Like, is he gone for real? And so, and I think the next day we ended up having so the next day I think was a holiday. So my interview ended up being that Tuesday then. So the next day was a Monday because it was Memorial Day. And we had a church picnic that day because I had already started going to the burning bush by then. And we had a church picnic on that Monday. And so Tuesday was my interview. And so I remember I called the lady on Tuesday morning to tell her that, hey, my dad had passed, to see if I could reschedule. But then something was just like, it's really nothing you can do right now. Like they was way in California. And even though my plan was to go to California for my dad's funeral and stuff, like I wasn't going right then and there because the funeral wasn't till the following week. And so I actually ended up telling her never mind, that I would just come to the interview because I didn't know where my mind was going to be after that, and I figured I would just get the interview over with. And so I actually went to the interview, and the president, I think I don't know, maybe the president of Victim Assistance Program, his name was Bob Denton. In any case, he actually ended up coming to my interview for whatever strange reason. He decided he wanted to do my interview. And so he interviewed me. And I remember partway through the interview, he stopped me and he was like, "Are you a woman of faith?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I am." And so he stopped the interview at that point and said, "Okay, well, the job is yours." He said, "I feel like this job should be yours based off of your faith." And so he shook my hand, gave me the job, and then I think the next day after that is I actually ended up flying out to California. So that's how that happened.
Okay, so you're doing this, you're doing the work with children who witness violence. Now you hear and you talk about and you see some, I don't even want to call it wild stuff, but like
wild stuff.
Yeah. Some stuff that, will touch you. So in the midst of doing this and seeing other kids and stuff go through trauma and stuff like that, was there ever a point where you questioned your purpose?
Yes, indeed. So me and my partner on this job, I actually ended up being partnered with the lady that I met at the daycare. And we were a really, really good team. So anytime the horror cases is what I call them, anytime those horrible cases came through, they was always assigned to us. And so I remember I had this one case, this little girl was 9 and she had been sexually assaulted by her mom's boyfriend. And so by the time we got the case, the mom had walked in on the little girl being assaulted by the boyfriend. And so she made her daughter go shower, like literally went and showered everything off of her before she took her to the hospital. Not because she was trying to protect her daughter by taking her to the hospital, but because she literally did this so she could wash away the evidence of her daughter being raped by the boyfriend. And so the crazy part was they couldn't find no DNA evidence that said this man did this, even though like during the examination, they could see she had been raped. Like they literally could see she had been raped, but because there was no DNA evidence so it was really like nothing they could do. And then at 9, that was oh my god, that was like the most horrible case I've ever worked on. Like it was just bad from beginning to end. But I remember when I first met her, like she wasn't 9, and I think that was why that thing triggered me, is because she was 9. And so I remember when I met her, and I was the one that was actually going to work hand in hand with this little girl. She wasn't 9; she was like not a kid. Like she wasn't a kid.
So
like
her age was 9, but
her age was 9, but like mentally, I mean, she was probably my age, and I was like 28 or something like that. But it was like she had the world on her shoulders. Like the way she talked, the way she acted was so much older. And I couldn't understand why, if y'all had evidence of the rape, why y'all couldn't do nothing for her. And then she was removed from her mom, but she wasn't removed from what happened to her. She was removed for something so totally random that it like literally blew my mind. Like, how was this possible? And so at the end of everything, come to find out, they dismissed the case because typically when you have like kid cases like that, like you go to the care center and they interview you once, and anybody who's going to be a part of this case is behind the window, so everybody hears the story one time. Not every couple days y'all asking this kid all of these questions, and then now as a kid I feel like, oh, y'all must not believe me, so then my story begins to change. And so that's what happened to this little girl. Instead of them doing it right the first time, she had like 50 million freaking interviews. And so by the time her story begins to change, then they say, oh, well, due to her story changing, we can't put her on a stand. She wouldn't be a reliable witness. And then we try not to put kids on the stand until they're 12 and all this nonsense. And so that just kind of broke. Like that was the first time, and all the time I had been doing that job. Like that was the one thing that like broke me. Like I'm talking about the ugly cry. Like I literally cried. Like I cried and I cried, and I was literally gonna walk away from the job at that point. And I remember I had went out and I was sitting in my car on my way to pick up Jalen and Janai. And the only thing I could think of was to call my mom. And so I ended up calling my mom. I'm just bawling my eyes out like, hey, I can barely talk, because I was so upset, because I felt like I didn't fail this girl. And then I feel like the system that should be there to protect this 9-year-old child, y'all have literally failed her. Like she's literally out here. Mom got visitations with her. You want to know who comes with mom to visit her daughter? The nasty old boyfriend that had been raping her. And so I couldn't understand why y'all know he's the perp and y'all are literally allowing this thing to happen. And so I lost it at that point. I was literally writing up my resignation, because it was like my heart couldn't take that thing that they did this girl like that.
So did you write up your resignation?
I did, but I didn't turn it in because my mom actually told me out.
Okay, that's what I was about to ask you. So what made you continue on that path in that job?
Because my mom, even at that point, my mom never acknowledged how my dad did me as a kid, because my dad targeted me more than like my siblings thought. Like now physically he didn't target me like he did them, but it was a lot of other stuff that they didn't know. And so I was talking to my mom, and she said, if there's never been a job for you, this is the job for you. And I really believe you need to stay there, because you can make a difference. She said, if this thing has affected you like that, then that means you can make a difference. And I don't think you should quit. And so after a couple days, I ended up changing my mind, and I never turned in a resignation. But because I had been sexually assaulted as a kid, then that gave me a new focus too, as part of where my career was going. So then I started focusing on the sexual assault side as well.
Okay. So Tiffany said, what happened to the boyfriend?
Absolutely nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing ever happened to the boyfriend. Mom continued to have visitations with her daughter, and the boyfriend was always with her when she came to pick up the daughter. Like one day they came to pick up the daughter, and I was at the house they was placed in, and they had to let her go. And like I couldn't. Like I actually ended up turning the case over. Like I actually ended up referring the case out, because there was, at that point, there's literally nothing you can do. Like I went to this whole talk session thing that they did about this case, and it was like nothing. Like it was literally nothing. Like there was like literally no help for this child, like none. So I mean, I ended up like referring it out at that point, because like that, it just did something to me. Like it was horrible.
So was it more external factors that made you question whether that was your purpose, still your purpose, or was it because you had went through that?
It was external.
External?
Yeah, because I, like, at this point, I've accepted that I'm supposed to be here to help people, and I couldn't help her.
Okay, so the external factors had you question. Okay, so she asked another question.
Yeah. So once I turned the case over, I tried not to, cases that I ended up referring out, like I tried not to follow those cases, because I had to. At that point, I was taking work home with me. Like I was literally a mess at that point. I didn't know how to separate that stuff. So once I referred her case out, like I didn't follow her case. Like the last piece of information I got was just literally more of the same. Like it was just more of the same. And so after that, I tried not to follow it anymore, because for me, even though I had referred her case out, I failed. Like I took that to heart. Like I failed this child, and it's like logically, I know it was like literally beyond my control. But because for me, I had found this purpose that I'm supposed to help little kids, and this one kid, of all the many cases I worked on and we had success on, this one case was just not. There was nothing. So for me, I felt like I had failed her.
Okay, so you talked a little bit about it where you after talking to your mom and then you refer this case out to somebody else. Then you talked a little bit about how you then moved into domestic violence work. So essentially your purpose is still in that vein, but it changes. In your I mean, is that
So I was still working with kids, like of all the stuff that we had, like most of the stuff we like that I ended up getting was literally like either sexual assault, like we had a couple school shootings type stuff. Um, but we ended up getting this case at the actual local shelter. And so I actually went to the shelter, and my same partner was like, "Oh, you should sign up to be a sub. Like you can just pick up for extra money. You can pick up shifts and all this other little stuff." And so by this one case that I had, that I it was different, because then I'm literally hand in hand with the moms at this point, like talking to the moms, like seeing me and all these little kids that's living at this shelter. And so that kind of, although I still did sexual assault at that point, it kind of, my focus did shift a little bit. And so I ended up signing up to be a sub at the shelter. I think that was December of 07. And from there, like I kind of never looked back really.
Okay, so how did your, because that's a change in your purpose, so to speak. Like it's still helping people, it's still being that protector, but it went from kids to now battered women's shelter. You know what I mean? So like,
I mean, in a sense, I was still working with the kids, but so I had this little boy, honestly, who I was working with, and he was 9. And it was always these 9-year-olds that kind of sparked these things in me, probably because I was 9 when my dad came home. That's kind of hindsight, actually. But he was 9, and I remember me and him was sitting there, and I was trying to like draw him into conversation, and they were actually living in the shelter. And I remember like he wouldn't respond to anything, like he never would say anything. And so probably like on my second visit with him, maybe this was my third visit, like he finally looks at me and he said, "How can you help me?" He was like, "Have you ever been through anything like this? Did you ever have to go to a shelter? Did you ever see your mom getting beat up and bloody and blah, blah, blah?" And he just like threw up all over me at that point. And so it stunned me. But at the same time, I actually was able to honestly answer him and say, yes, I have. Like, that's how I grew up. And from there, me and him was fast friends up until he actually ended up graduating. But based off of that experience, that's when I really like started being like very interested in like shelter work. Like, oh, this is where I'm gonna find like what it is I'm looking for. And the crazy part is although I could see myself in some of that, that's when I began to learn what domestic violence was and what child abuse was. Like there was never terms for me growing up. I didn't know what it was called. It wasn't until I began working in the field that I'm like, oh, that was domestic violence, or oh, that was child abuse, or oh, that's what that was. Like that's how I started putting all that stuff together.
So what role do you feel like your childhood and your first marriage, what role do you feel like those play in I don't even want to use the word pushing, but ushering you into first the children who witness violence and then into battered women's shelter, working with the kids there, and then moving forward to more so working with the adult population?
That's a good question. I don't know. I was being fulfilled, is I guess the best way I can do it. Like, although some of those cases was bad cases and stuff like that, to be able to hold my hand, because in a sense, I really felt like I was helping myself. Like, oh, no one could do this for me when I was in their shoes. Like, I didn't know there was a battered women's shelter. I didn't know there was a victim assistance. Right. I didn't know any of that. So for me, I really felt like I was picking myself up and helping. Like, oh, that's one more kid that won't have to end up like Tia Payne. That's one more kid that won't do this. And one more kid that, oh, that's a mom that I could help when I wasn't able to help my mom. So I felt like I was being fulfilled doing that job. And I mean, and not to say that, but I still literally love the type of work that I do. Like that has never changed over all of these years. It never changed. Like I still thoroughly enjoyed going and hearing the stories and helping and being able to offer something from my experiences that I didn't really know at the time was something that was going to be able to help people, but I at least understood where they were coming from. So being able to do that, like I just began to grow in the field. Like I found out about, oh, you should probably go to therapy because you have some issues, and so just kind of following that path, like I grew up in the field healing at the same time, which I highly don't recommend. But for me, because I didn't know those were real things, it was different for me. So I literally grew up in this field while walking through a healing journey at the same time.
So what part did your faith play in all of this? Because like you said, like because we're like I work in essentially a rape crisis center on campus at Kent State. And when we have interns and stuff like that, we want to make sure like if they've been victimized that hey, they're you know what I'm saying? Like obviously not 100% healed, but not going through that healing journey of like being triggered by different things. Yeah. So like so how did you find that balance?
I didn't know anything different. And that's like the best way I can explain it. Like I didn't know anything different. I didn't know like
because you didn't know you needed healing.
Yeah, I didn't know I needed healing. Yeah, that was literally years down the line. I just felt like, oh, these couple bad things happened to me, so this is, I found the type of work I wanted to do. It honestly, it wasn't until me and you was married that I started feeling triggered, so to speak. So this was after me and you was married because you brought abnormal, if that makes sense. So I had lived in toxic all that time, but then getting married to somebody whose agenda was totally different. Like you were abnormal to me, even though we had been friends and dating all those years, you were the abnormal. So for me, my normal was living in a toxic environment, like the arguing, the fussing, the tension, all of those type of things. And then you're totally opposite. So although you're normal, for me, you were abnormal. So that's when I began to like experience triggers and all of those type of things. So that's when that kind of happened. I didn't recognize, that I needed healing at the time I was working there. I just felt like, oh, I love this job. I'm doing good work doing this job. But yeah, being triggered is when I actually married you.
So you were so used to just existing and just going on with your life and just I'm doing all the stuff I need to do.
Yeah, but that was toxic.
No, I know, but I'm saying that's what you were used to. So in the process of that being your purpose, or one, you didn't even necessarily realize you had multiple purposes within, you know what I mean, within
that one little purpose.
Within that one spectrum of purpose. Because I mean, you know what I mean, like sometimes we look and like, what's my purpose?
Right.
And it's like, no, like you're in so many different circles that you have purposes. You know what I'm saying? It's just what season you're in. Like, so for you, to me, what I'm hearing, part of your purpose was not only to stand in the gap, so to speak, but also like start your healing process.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So, so that was going to be my next question. Like, what part does your current and long-standing marriage play in you walking in your purpose? And not only that, but also continuing just the daily, because it's like, to me, healing is a lifelong type thing. You know what I mean? Like, yes, you're healing, but it's something that is, you can't never say when, you know what I'm saying? When like, hey, because you never know what might trigger you, especially when you're talking about you've been abused or like you've been assaulted and stuff like that. Um, so like, what part does your marriage now play in you
To you,
understanding to me? What part does it play in you understanding now the purpose in the stuff that you had to go through?
um, so so I met you when I was fresh out of high school, 18, you cheating at spades, whatever. That
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to digress there.
Mm-hmm.
So,
$50.
but this was the funny thing was you was the guy that kind of didn't, you just treated me like Tia, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was a virgin. And so and a lot of people knew I was a virgin. So a lot of my pursuit wasn't really for me, if that makes sense. And so you were literally the only person that you didn't necessarily pursue me. We just happened to end up being friends.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, after I came back from the military, after I had left, we still remained friends and then began to date. And you were normal. Like you brought you brought a sense of normalcy to me, to where I literally was so closed off from the world. Like I didn't, I mean, I had my ways, don't get me wrong, but I didn't necessarily open Tia up to relationships, even if
Mm-hmm.
I, did whatever I did. It wasn't because I wanted a relationship with you. It was, because whatever. And so, but you was different. I was able to, because you treated me different, I was able to give pieces of myself that I had never gave to anybody else. And so then when we went our separate ways, you know, normal came back to me in the ex-husband,
Mm.
because he was still a part of my childhood that was normal for me.
Right.
So once the comfort of you was gone, I went back to what was comfortable, and that
Mm.
was him. And so, of course, through that whole toxic situation, me and you never lost contact. We actually still remained friends, talking through that whole toxic marriage. So then, okay, I'm divorced. Me and you, you followed me to the burning bush, and so we ended up dating. We ended up dating at a church
You and
where
Marcus Allen.
we ended up dating at the church that I was able to figure out that I didn't have to stay in an abusive marriage,
Mm-hmm.
and then came back to the my friend that I was most comfortable with, that I could laugh with, that I could let my hair down, that I could do all of these things, and I never ever got judged for some of those things. Like
Mm-hmm.
there was no room for judgment in our relationship. And so that actually began to help. So then, okay, here we are, we're married. And so being married to somebody normal, those things began to trigger me to where then it's like, oh, something wrong with me. Like I literally would walk around like a lot in the beginning of our marriage, swearing that something was wrong with me because how I was felt, how you made me feel. Like now that we married, like even though we dated, we never lived together until we
Mm-hmm.
got married. So living with normal, when I'm so used to the unhealthy, abnormal aspects of a relationship, or even seeing that, and now like that was the hardest part. Like people don't understand that when you come from an abnormal situation that's toxic, learning to be normal is the hardest thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like learning to live in a normal, healthy
Mm-hmm.
relationship, that was hard. That was hard. Not leaving toxic and all that. That was my easy, but trying to adjust to be in a normal, healthy relationship where somebody ain't trying to call me no name or push me around or do all of the horrible stuff that my ex did, that even though it was not normal, and I knew there was a part of me that it wasn't normal, it was still very normal for me because that's how I grew up. So then trying to figure out how to do you, oh listen, that part was crazy. Like that sounds weird, but that was nuts. Like, oh my God, he's normal. Like, what am I supposed to do with him? Like he wants to hug me. What am I supposed to do with that? So that was like, that start pulling some pieces of
Mm-hmm.
Tia out, that for me that was like, oh, he did this, so that triggered me in a way that I'm not used to, or that triggered me in a way that I'm not used to.
Mm-hmm.
And then don't add the kids to the mix from toxic marriage. That was a whole nother trigger in itself. But because again, going back to the question you originally asked about faith, because my faith played such a big role in you know, some of the walks that I took, I began to pray, like, guys, you have to help me. Like, guys, you have to help me because I believe I'm supposed to be married to this person, but the way it's going now, like, of course, I mean, I tell people all the time, I'm the one shouting divorce all the time. There were times I wanted to pack up and leave because I was so very uncomfortable living normally. Like, it's weird to say that, but that was very uncomfortable trying to rearrange my mind to live with somebody that I don't got to walk on eggshells with, or that actually comes home, or ain't spitting on me, or ain't punching me, or boxing me in corners and all that type of stuff. Like, I'm supposed to breathe now. I get to breathe, my kids get to have fun, all those type of things. So that was actually very hard, but it started doing some stuff that made me recognize that, okay, I need to work some of this trauma out. So being married to you is how I ended up being able to really recognize that I had some deep rooted stuff that I needed to work on. And that's when I actually started kind of seeking help, if that makes sense. So I got some questions. I mean, yeah, I would probably say that's true, honestly. I mean, I always thought Jew was my husband, but he was running from me even though he was stalking me at the same time, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, I just heard her say I wasn't pursuing her like that.
So yes, he was like, Jew literally from the time I was 18 was always like my safe haven. Like, when something was going on, Jew was the person I called. The only person I wrote when I was in the military was Jew. Like, he's always been that constant since I was 18, even through a toxic marriage. Like, we never lost that. He was the person that would come to see me when stuff got bad or came to the hospital. Like, it was always him through like all of that. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I've always thought he was my husband, even through the toxic marriage and all that good stuff, bad stuff, I should say.
Okay, so last question, or combination of questions. It's all one question, really. So what's the final outcome? What is your, or what has been your purpose or purposes based off of what's been birthed out of the stuff that those two situations? I know there's obviously more painful situations in life and stuff like that, but of those two, because those are the two that are most well known, you know what I'm saying, in regards to your story. So what are the purposes that have been birthed out of those pains?
Well, one is starting Legacy 31. Like, I really feel like God just downloaded into me over a 2.5, 3 hour period of time on how he wanted that thing to look. And for me, because they're the faith-based piece that came with domestic violence or sexual assault is this hush hush thing that don't nobody talk about, because God don't let bad stuff happen to good people type of thing. So that was kind of how Legacy 31 was birthed, to begin to change that narrative. Like, hey, we got to do something when it comes to, bad stuff do happen to good church people, and it do happen in church. Because that was my story twofold. As a kid and in my first marriage, we were still in the church. And a lot of stuff that I would say was overlooked, or I'm being pushed to stay in a toxic, abusive marriage. And so Legacy 31 was kind of birthed out of both of those situations to begin changing the narrative about that. Like, that's not what the Bible say. Like, God don't want you to sit and get beat in your face all the time just because you married somebody. And then even with that, like, because our paths cross the same when it comes to the type of work that we do. And so even through Legacy 31, being able to sign different contracts to where we're going out speaking and teaching and doing all those type of things. So it all started like just kind of falling in place. And I think a lot of that was me being obedient, even when I chose to write the book. Like that was kind of the catalyst to when I really began to start healing. But that was in 2017. So at that point, we had been married, 8 years or something like that. So writing that book, at that point, I had to deal with my childhood. Like, I had to finally be like, I was an abused kid. Like, my dad did some damage. And so because I wrote the book, then I had to deal with all of those things that I had hid away. And, even for me to be the person that want to help everybody, like everybody always told me I was mean. And I like could never understand like why do people tell me I'm mean when I think I'm like the coolest person ever. But in any case, but or people will always say, why you look so mean? What you mad about? Like I always people always ask me that and I could never understand that. And I'm thinking like, well, I don't know what you're talking about because I'm trying to help you, but you telling me I look mean. So then I'm mad because you told me I look mean and I'm mad all the time. So now I am mad. But because people kept saying that, like I remember this one day I was praying and I was like, how can I be effective in helping people if everybody's scared to come talk to me because they think I'm mean?
Right.
And so then that prompted me to really start doing some work. And then I remember this one day I was talking to pastor, like I was in like a counseling session with him, and I was kind of talking about those things. And I remember he told me, he said, your face was a learned behavior to save you from people coming at you. And he said, just like you learn for your face to be blank or look a certain way, you can unlearn that same behavior.
Right.
And so by him telling me that, I was able to, I don't want to say change my face, so to speak, but that kind of broke something.
Change your face.
Yeah, but it kind of broke something for me to really start thinking about it from that, because that's literally why my face became so blank, is because that was my way of saving myself from my dad. He couldn't tell what if I was bothered or hurt or upset or anything. And so I started doing the work from that standpoint. Like, why did I start looking like that to begin with? Like, what was the reason behind that? So in writing my book, I had to start really digging into like all of those things. And me writing a book, like it was years, like with me crying. Like I always tell people, like I'm not a big crier. Like I don't do a lot of crying. But once I finished the book, published the book, people bought the book, I decided to read the book. Like it's different writing it. Like it took me 10 years to write the book because it was like, oh, I don't want to deal with that. Nope, not dealing with that one. Oh, absolutely not. We're definitely not going to deal with that one. So by the time I actually was like, okay, God need me to finish this book. Let me finish the book. And so I finally finished the book, published the book, and then a couple months after, I decided to read the book. So I read it from the beginning to the end and spent like probably a couple weeks crying. Like you ain't even know that, but I spent like a couple weeks crying, like, oh my God, like what happened to me? Like, this is real stuff that happened to me. Like, how could this stuff happen to me? And that was a whole nother spiral. And so in my prayer this one day, I was like, God, I need somebody to talk to. I need to sit down and talk. And so God literally told me who to go talk to. And so that I ended up reaching out to that person, and we went through probably a good 2 months of me like pouring out. And I was able to start doing some real deep type healing at that point. Because I bottle emotions because I don't want to deal with emotions. Right. Like, so I bottled them up. And so I was able to really start pouring all of that trash, all the hurt, the pain, the trauma, all of those type of things that I had just stuffed down for so many years. I was able to actually start getting all of those things out with a neutral party who actually sat there and took me through some steps to to really do that work. And then after that, it became easier to start really walking in healing after that, like really like falling in love with purpose, because Legacy 31 didn't even come until 2 years even after that point. That was 2019. So but it took me finally having to face everything that I had been through and call it by name. Call me being sexually assaulted, sexual assault. Call me being abused. That was child abuse. This was domestic violence. Calling those things by name, like recognizing that these things really did happen to me. And it was not my fault that these things happened to me. And so once I was able to do that, then, I went through that 2-year period of time where, I was still working at the shelter and doing some different stuff. And then, in beginning of 2019, I was sitting on my couch, and then I just heard, Legacy 31, the scripture.
Sitting on our couch.
The everything. And I just started like writing all of that stuff out of what Legacy 31 is. And then, God began to grow it after that.
All right. So we are out of time, but I do want to give you the floor one last time to do like parting shot or whatever. And just in your parting shot, if you could, just speak to that person that is struggling with finding their purpose, but also walking in their purpose, like where they're struggling to stay in their purpose because of past hurt. Like, you know what I mean? Like ready to give up or just like it's too tough. You know what I mean? Like it's gonna be tough, but they're like, look, it's too tough. I want to change career paths because this brings back so many, you know what I mean? So many memories of whatever I went through, whatever happened. Um, just talk to them for a minute. A
Um,
minute. No, I'm just fine.
Honestly, I had to get over the shame of my past, like being an alcoholic. I had to get over that. Like it was so many things that I was ashamed of that I did as a result of my trauma. And so I think that was the hardest part about me embracing what my purpose was. Is because I literally, we had talked about this once before, that I literally had to begin to forgive myself for the things that I felt like was my fault, even though logically I know they weren't my fault. Like me marrying my ex, like I had to forgive myself for marrying him because it was like, okay, I should have never married him,
I
So
had to forgive you for that. No, I'm just playing.
so all of those things, like it was so much shame attached to it. And so until I dealt with the shame of everything that happened to me and choices that I made, I couldn't really fully embrace what God was calling me to do. Like I had to reconcile my shame and the things that happened in my past before I could speak about it. Like I wrote a book, but literally I didn't begin to talk about like it was easier to talk about what happened to me as a kid, because logically most people look at you as a kid and be like, man, you were so innocent, like that shouldn't happen to you.
Right.
But my victimization when I'm a full grown woman who I feel like should have known better and never married that fool, like that was the piece of me that was like, oh, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to tell nobody about that. So I'm out here sharing my story about my dad. I got a whole book behind me and all this type of stuff. But it literally wasn't until a couple years ago that I actually began to speak about the personal victimization in a marriage like that. That took even more because I still had shame attached to that. But once I really kind of like decided like, oh no, you did it, not me. Like, why am I walking around feeling ashamed of something that you did? Like you did these things to me, but I'm holding on to all the guilt and all the shame and all the everything that came with that, like it was my fault. And so counseling started helping me work through some of all those type of things. And so I was finally able to throw that back on that door. That's yours, that's yours, that's yours. And by being able to really sit and recognize that I didn't do it. No, you chose to do these things to me. I didn't choose to do it to myself. And began to forgive myself. And like part of that came with relearning who Tia was, like learning the things that I love. Like I really had to pour into myself. And like you hear people say it all the time that you got to really love yourself. Like you really got to love yourself. You got to believe that you are worth more than the shame and the trauma and all those things that happen to you. You got to believe that you're worth more than all of those things, and that God truly, like, I'm his daughter. Like I tell people all the time, I'm his favorite. Even though everybody else might be, but I'm his favorite.
I was listening to a song today that was saying that.
Right. Like I really had to start believing that. I really had to start embracing that God truly, truly loved me and didn't wish any of that on me. Like I had to reconcile my unforgiveness that I had for every single person that hurt me. Like I literally had to forgive them. I had to let all of that stuff go. And until I was able to do all that, I was not fully able to embrace walking into where God began to call me. Like I had to let all of that stuff go, because how effective was I going to be to sit and try to hold your hand through your trauma? But I'm mad because my ex-husband spit on me, And so I couldn't do that. And so I had to really begin to like let all that type of stuff go and really realize that, like I got some trauma and I had some pain and I had all this stuff, but the purpose, like I don't wish that on anybody. I would never want to go through it again, but because I did go through it, that meant God had purpose attached to that. And then I was able to start seeing like, okay, God, I see where you're taking me. Okay, God, I see what you're doing here. Okay, God, I see what you're doing here. But it came with a lot of forgiveness. It came with a lot of, laying on my face, like talking to God about all this stuff that I still had down here. like until I was able to really get rid of all that type of stuff, then it wasn't much that I could do with my purpose.
Mm.
Like I can't walk in purpose when I got unforgiveness and I got hate in my heart and I feel a certain type of way about you, or I felt a certain type of way about his mom because you watched him spit in my
Mm-hmm.
face and rub it in and you didn't do it. I had to forgive her. I had to forgive him for how they treated my kids. Like all of
Mm-hmm.
those things, I had to really, start forgiving all of those people that was attached to that shame and trauma that I had. And then I was able to reconcile all of that and just begin to let it go. And so now when I go out and share my story, I'm not ashamed of my story no more. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
ashamed that I was an alcoholic. I'm not ashamed that I did this or did. I'm not ashamed of any of those things.
So real fast.
I was talking too long, is what you're saying?
No, I'm just saying real fast because we already passed 10 o'clock. And we want to be respectful of people's time. But okay, so you said that you were holding on to all this unforgiveness and stuff like that. In the midst of that, was God still showing you your purpose?
Yes. Yes, he was.
And you just weren't walking towards it?
I wasn't.
You could honestly, you couldn't.
I couldn't. And then most of the times, like, I feel these little nudges from God, like go here, go there, and I'm going the other direction. Like, absolutely not. We're not ready for that.
So if you I got you. So he's still showing you your purpose, but you don't have the ability to even walk into it because
I wasn't ready to let some of that stuff go.
You were emotional.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Definitely. Like if we're like, I tell kids in sports, like, play with emotion, but don't be emotional. So like if you're too emotional about past trauma or past things, then that's going to cloud you walking into your purpose. And I'm not saying you can't show emotion and stuff like that or feel, but because you're still upset or because I'm going to hold on to this animosity and all this different stuff. Yeah, he's showing me, but guess what? I ain't going to talk to nobody.
Right. Yeah. And that's literally how it was. Like I had so much. I was an angry person. I tried to kill my dad. Like I was angry. Like I was very, very angry. I had a lot of anger built up. And I had to let some of all that stuff. Like I was plotting in my head how I was gonna get rid of people type stuff. So I had to let a lot of that stuff go. But I had to want to let it go. Right. Like a lot of people don't realize that when you grow up in trauma and toxic and all that, that becomes your identity. That becomes who you are. And so it's hard to get rid of those things because then it's like, well, who am I going to be after that?
Right.
Like, I can't talk about it no more. Like, because this is what defines who I am. This gets the biggest ooh or the biggest ah. When I say these things and I'm mad about it. But if I let this stuff go, if I really give this thing to God, I don't have that anymore. And who am I going to be? And so it's different for me to feel those tangible things and replace it with the tangible God. You know what I mean? Like a lot of people can't reconcile that. And so I had to want to feel something different. I had to want to be happy. I had to want to feel joy. I had to want all of those things before I was able to fully embrace my purpose and begin to walk in that direction.
All right. Thank you. So that concludes all the questions I have. Very enlightening, enriching conversation. I don't want to call it an interview, but just thank you. Thank you for sharing. I hope somebody got something out of this. Because it's not always going to be easy to walk in your purpose. It's not even going to always be easy to identify your purpose. But just like you said, you hear from God or you hear God telling you to go a certain way, go. Go. He telling you to let stuff go, let it go. Don't hold yourself hostage because of past trauma and stuff like that. So that's all I have to say. Do you have anything else, dear?
No, dear.
All right. We appreciate everybody for tuning in.
I think that's true.
Okay. Yeah, so we appreciate everybody. We'll be back in a couple weeks. We won't have a topic yet, but I'm sure we'll have a good one.
We always got good topics. We never don't have good topics. It's gonna take some prayer. Like it really do take some prayer. And I had this one person ask me pretty much that same question. And I told him, I said, sometimes when we don't know the correct path, if we don't know nothing else, we know that we can be a witness to God, for God. Like we can always talk about his goodness and his grace, because somebody still need to hear that as well. Right. So that's still part of my purpose, even though my purpose was attached to a lot of pain and trauma and all that type of stuff. At the end of the day, I'm not getting the glory out of all that. God is actually getting the glory out of all that. So if nothing else, our purpose is to bring God glory. And so until he gives you clear direction, know that your purpose is to bring him glory. That's the purpose of us being here. The purpose of us going through some of the things that we've been through is to literally bring him glory.
You got an inbox her, so she want a book.
Okay. So
we're gonna get you your book, Tiffany.
Yeah. So if nothing else, know that bringing God glory is part of your purpose until you get some clear direction on what it is that he wants you to do. And I that's one thing that I'm remembering every single time I go share my story. I don't ever share my story without talking about God and about some of the things that God, some of the stuff that I didn't mention tonight, but some of the things that God has done for me through all of this stuff that I've been through that could only have been God. I always make sure I mention those things because I don't ever want to go tell my story or share anything that I've been through without first giving honor to God. Because if it hadn't been for God, pulling me along and lead me along the way, I would have never got through some of the stuff that I've been through. And so I always remember that, like, God, you deserve the glory for my story. I don't. It was hard work, but it was, it only was able to work because God, helped me along the way. And so he deserves that glory. That is part of my purpose, is to bring him glory. So
cool.
We will see you guys in 2 weeks.
Peace.
2 whole weeks.
2 whole weeks. We off. Still on.
Yeah, we about to be off. All right, guys. Guys. Yeah, they did. He was on there. Have a good night.